Good afternoon. We're excited to be with you and anxious to engage in a little bit of a discussion. I will introduce myself and ask the other two judges to introduce themselves, and then we'll ask you to introduce yourselves. My name is Murray Snow. I'm the Chief Judge for the United States District Court for Arizona.
Good afternoon. My name is Tammy Waller, and I'm the Director for K-12 Social Studies and World and Native Languages, also from Arizona at the Department of Education.
Good afternoon. I'm Lynn Simons, and I'm a District Court Judge in Washoe County, Nevada. And it's nice to see all of you. And I'm going to ask you to take a very deep breath right now. And we're looking forward to hearing you.
All right. Would you present yourselves to us, please?
Good afternoon, judges. My name is Brianna Salas. In addition to We the People, I have been enrolled in JROTC for 4 years and have been the Special Projects Officer at our school for 2 years in a row.
Hello, judges. My name is Laura Ann Moore. Outside of We the People, I am a competitive equestrian, and next year I plan on attending the University of the South in Tennessee.
Hello, judges. How's it going? I'm Christian Schmenk, and after high school, I intend on going to Howard University for political science and literature.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all briefly. As you know, you're Unit 6, what challenges might face American constitutional democracy in the 21st century. And the question for today is, President Dwight D. Eisenhower said, quote, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Do you agree or disagree, and why? What disagreements did the founders have about a standing army, and are they relevant today? And to what extent should there be an international U.S. military presence?" You may begin.
In President Eisenhower's farewell address, he declares, "We must never let the weight of the combination of military and industry endanger our liberties or democratic process." We agree with Eisenhower's assessment of military power and his warning against unwarranted influence with the military-industrial complex because it has and continues to give industrial contractors more influence in Congress than the people themselves, removing our popular sovereignty.
The military-industrial complex is the use of industrial resources to develop the economy through military spending. To understand how the military-industrial complex creates unwarranted influence, we can look to Gordon Adams' concept of the Iron Triangle, a three-way alliance between legislators in Congress, bureaucrats, and interest groups.
For instance, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has been on the board of Raytheon Technologies since 2016, which is the third largest defense contractor in the country. This demonstrates a dangerous relationship of power between representatives and an industrial entity that don't serve the common good, but rather the private interest of the US's emphasis on defense.
The Federalist and Anti-Federalist founders disagreed over whether the new nation should have a standing army. Because the British were quartered in colonist homes during the Revolutionary War, many Americans were wary of standing armies. Anti-Federalists believed that having a standing army would endanger the liberties of the people. Brutus X warns that an army will subvert the forms of government to establish a new one, according to the pleasure of the leader.
On the contrary, the Federalists were concerned of the massive threat of the ongoing threat of the massive British army. They believed that having a standing army would protect the people and that it was vital to the national defense. Federalist 24 argues for an army run by the legislative branch instead of the executive, saying that Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2, which prevents Congress from spending money on an army for longer than 2 years, will be a great and real security against the keeping up of troops without evident necessity.
Today's disagreements over large military budget reflect the founders' disagreements over the standing army. Additionally, both the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were concerned by presidential power over the military. The founders' arguments are relevant today because of the rise of presidential war power, from FDR's expansion of executive orders to Truman's seizure of steel mills and George Bush using the unitary presidential theory in the recent war on terror.
At this point in our military development, there still needs to be an international military presence to protect our allies and our economic interests. The US should scale back our international spending rather than our international presence.
The expansion of our military presence can date back to the Spanish-American War, where the US violated the Monroe Doctrine by taking the Philippines. Post-World War II, the Truman Doctrine and NSC 68 drastically increased military spending, stating that the US would provide international aid for communist-threatened countries.
The U.S. should prioritize security over economic interests when it comes to our military presence. George Washington declared, "To be prepared for war is one of the most effective means of preserving peace." Thus, we should maintain good relations with our allies and utilize our forward bases.
However, we should cut back on our spending to use internally. Head of the National Guard Bureau, General Joseph Langle, suggests that if the Guard and Reserve grew in numbers with corresponding cuts to the active duty forces, the U.S. can save $30 billion each year.
In a speech to NATO, former President Eisenhower declared, "The problem in defense is how far you can go without destroying from within what you're trying to defend from without." Thank you.
Thank you. I believe in your testimony, you indicated that there has been a gradual accretion of presidential power over the war power. Let me ask, what power does the Constitution give to the Congress in regulating the military, and how can it exercise that power, or has it tried to do so?
So
Well-
the Congress has war powers in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12 and 13, giving them the power to declare war and the power to raise an army. And these are the powers that we have seen the Congress use in order to control presidential war power.
In addition, we can see that the executive is the head of the military, and the president cannot do anything without Congress's approval. But we can see violations of this, especially with President Nixon's bombing of Cambodia without Congress's approval.
Okay, so for question number 2, I'm going to go back to that very beginning of your testimony. And I'm going to ask that if you had the ear of a congressperson, what types of reforms would you suggest to deal with what you see as the widespread power of the defense industry?
So one thing that I would definitely address is the issue of lobbying and corporate lobbying to promote financial spending and expenditures in the military. For instance, the For the People Act has a clause that states that transparency from super PACs and dark money providers have to be transparent with their funding, and as well as a reversal of Citizens United, as well as Buckley v. Vallejo, to remove that of the First Amendment protection of a lot of these large companies that can outspend the voice of the people and remove our popular sovereignty.
In addition to my colleague, we can use transparency if the Library of Congress opens a de facto forum where all of these transactions are open and available to every person, and this would solve the issue of transparency with lobbying.
So your position that we should scale back on international spending, but not on presence. I'd like to ask you a bit about really a current issue, and that is using the Spratly Islands in the South China Seas as an example. What are the positive and or negative aspects of a US military presence there?
So the actual usage of a military presence and having boots on the ground is beneficial for establishing a personable interaction with the local people in order to gauge the climate towards the US, while also maintaining an influence that can prevent an extant influence or a competitor from edging out our advantage that we've actually established with this nation and these islands, as you mentioned.
But wouldn't it be more of a naval presence because of the valued trade waters?
Yeah, so we can also see an example of this being also very beneficial, I believe in 2017, when 3 aircraft carriers were patrolling the South China Sea as well as North Korea in order to use it as a show of power and remind North Korea that we are a presence and are a threat to them. So it does serve as an advantage of securing our domestic and international needs by reminding our adversarial countries that we do in fact have a presence and that it should be recognized.
Well, what are the advantages and disadvantages of a draft?
The advantages of a draft is that, according to political science Robert Riohain, a draft could also help bring up civic engagement in the United States. Right now, we haven't had a draft, of course, since the Vietnam War, and there has been less civic engagement. And instead of a draft, I would also recommend compulsory service and just push towards participation in the nation.
Yeah, furthermore, we can also see, especially in examples of like World War II in Korea, where the draft worked a lot better than it did in Vietnam. That is a good way to promote that military industrial complex that we're actually using. We can look not only to enlisted men, but the Rosy Riveters as well, and adjusting to our industrial might to help bring up the country's economy and also defend our allies internationally and domestically, which is still one of the prime directives of our military industrial complex today.
How is it that the draft worked better in Korea than it did in Vietnam?
Well, because of the time period that Vietnam took place in, many people were resisting against the government, and there was many different protests against the draft during the Vietnam War. For example, many people burned their draft cards in protest of the draft.
And furthermore, this is a period where people were starting to believe that the voting age should be reduced to 18, as there is a quote that if they're old enough to fight, they ought to be old enough to vote. And this expansion of progressive ideals for people fighting and also wanting to be represented in the country was also much more prevalent during the Vietnam era rather than the Korean era.
Should the National Guard be deployed domestically? And if so, under what circumstances?
So yes, the National Guard is more of a anti-federalist construction, seeing as it's a militia that the anti-federalists were arguing more for. But to your point, it should be deployed, especially and as it is deployed in a lot of humanitarian relief crises, especially in like the hurricanes, like Hurricane Katrina in the South, in the past few decades. They show that they're not only like a militia, but they also serve the common good by providing aid for people and making sure that the general populace is safe, ensuring domestic tranquility.
For example, an example of when the National Guard should not be deployed, in my opinion, would be during internal conflicts in states. So, for example, the protests in Portland during the summer of 2020 in regards to the killing of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, the National Guard was deployed here, and this caused a big uproar because the National Guard is supposed to protect the nations, and the states felt like they should be policing this themselves instead of the National Guard.
So following along with your statement that there should be compulsory service participation, can you expand on that and give me some examples?
Yes, in an article of Time magazine, it is suggested that every time there is a child born, the government sets aside $5,000 for this child that they add on to it with interest. And when the child turns 18 to 25, if they participate in some sort of service, they can collect this money, but only it serves sort of as a GI Bill that they can only be used as for a loan or like for student loans or just for tuition.
Furthermore, we could also look to a hypothetical situation of making a compulsory voting as well, which can be enacted on a holiday as the For the People Act proposed. And if people don't show up, then it can be obligated to become an hour of community service to promote civic engagement and continue the flow of our demographics in the democratic process.
Thank you. Well, enjoyed very much your presentation, and thank you for letting us be a part of it. You had very good current knowledge, and you also had at least your arms around what you might call academic literature. You used the iron triangle concept. You told us about Lloyd Austin being the revolving door between government and Raytheon service, which is a good example of what we're talking about. You used some intriguing ideas about when the United States may have violated its own principles, and some other good thoughts that I thought demonstrated a very good preparation and overall knowledge. There were one or two areas where you might have gone a little bit further to demonstrate your knowledge. For example, when I asked what Congress might be able to do to assert its power, and what we're really talking about is military budgets, right? And who does the Constitution give the power to fund the military to, or to not fund the military to? So along with the power of declaring war and not declaring war, probably Congress's most basic control over the military that is constitutionally granted is the right to cut military budgets. And that's the question really that is behind the whole question of what we do about a military industrial complex. Of course, you could always dwell on things that you might have said but didn't, and I don't mean to, by saying that, to suggest that you didn't have a very excellent presentation, which you most definitely did. Thank you for letting me be a part of it.
I also thought you had an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I think what I really liked was your conversational tone. You have a plethora of knowledge. Just when you were talking, you have data, you have all sorts of information, but you do a really good job of having a conversational tone with it. It's not like you're just spouting off, you're thinking about it, you're applying it. In most cases, you're directly addressing the question and then giving your evidence to the question. So I really appreciated that. And I really appreciated the fact that you brought up things like Citizens United, and that's the first time we've heard that. We've heard the issue of the Iron Triangle and the issue with defense contracting, but this is the first time we've heard some information about some of the things that exist that could limit that, as opposed to just military budget cuts and things like that. I really enjoyed it, and I think you did a great job. And I echo Judge Snow.
So I echo my colleagues. I thought your pace was great and your emphasis was great. You complemented each other very well. On a constructive criticism, I would simply say, don't forget that in Nevada, our National Guard is helping us get vaccines. And that's another thing that you can bring into, along with, and I love that you just said the humane deployment, because they're, in addition, I don't know that I've heard so many presidents referenced in one session, and I thought that was really good. And it was interesting how just you so easily provided that little bit more of evidence or support for your position, that you weren't too conclusionary and that you tied something together. And I really enjoyed it. I thought you did a great job, and thank you for letting me be a part of it.
Thank you all so much for your time, judges. Thank you.
And with that, thank you very much for allowing us to spend this afternoon with you.